On. Okay, today is October 4th. It's 1 o'clock Eastern time. So this is our Latin studies meeting for the week. This week, we're going to talk about Latin grammar because we've talked about Latin vocabulary and Latin reading in recent weeks, and student work in Latin reading looks very good. So I'm not going to talk about that until I see some new problems, but Latin reading work looks very good. A couple more students coming in. So today I'd like to talk about Latin grammar because I want to help you learn to use our grammar book as a reference book anytime you have a question about Latin. Now, I know that some of you are studying Latin because your parents are making you, and if you had the choice, you would fly away and study something else. And some of you are actually pretty nerdy about languages, and you like studying languages like me. And you have questions about things, you're curious about other readings and stuff like that. You want to know why, why the translation is what it is. Well, all of those answers are found in grammar. So in order to really understand the why of Latin and be able to translate different things, you have to know grammar. So what I'd like to do today is take a look at our grammar textbook and help you learn to use it as a reference book, okay? Because even if you're on lesson 1 or lesson 2 or lesson 3, you may have a question about something that is in lesson 25, but you could easily look it up and find that information if you learn how to use the grammar book. Zoriana said, sorry you're late. Just so you know, I won't start the meetings until 1:05. I recommend you try to get here a little early. There's a saying that says to be early is to be on time, and to be on time is to be late. I don't know if you ever heard that, but usually with Zoom meetings, and this is just a good rule for you in general because you're probably going to use Zoom meetings all the time as you get older. I use them myself with my own studies, not just CLA, but other stuff. So it's usually like good etiquette to get there 10 minutes early or so and get settled in, okay? So just try to learn to be a little early, actually. So what I'd like to do today is share this grammar book with you, walk through this a little bit, and show you how you can use it as a tool, okay? So I'm going to share my screen here. I've got the grammar book already ready for us. Just so you know, when I'm sharing my screen, the chat window disappears, and what I'll do is every once in a while, I'll take a break and go back and check it out. So if you're just sitting there typing questions away and I'm not responding, it's not because I'm ignoring you. Don't get angry at me. It's just because I don't see them while I'm looking at something else on the screen. Okay, so in Latin grammar, we've got this big fat Latin grammar book that covers everything in Latin grammar. And it's called a reference grammar because it's intended to be used as a reference book, just like you would have a dictionary. I don't think many of you sit around reading the dictionary when you're bored. Maybe some of you do. But most people don't read the dictionary or study the dictionary. They just use it to find things when things pop up. It's a reference book. An encyclopedia works the same way. You just look something up when you have a question. You don't sit around reading it. And one funny issue though is one time, my kids, I don't know if it was like a library book sale or something, but one of them chose to buy an encyclopedia, but all they got was the book for the letter B. And they used to sit around reading the B encyclopedia book all the time. So they only knew stuff about things that started with the letter B. But it's a reference book, okay? It's meant to be used as a reference book. And this grammar book is a reference book. So now you don't have a printed copy of it, and I don't necessarily recommend you buy one because it doesn't always help. But if you can get a copy of this because the links in the lessons link you to the book, and then once you get it, you can download it onto your computer. And if you just start using it whenever you've got a question about Latin, you can learn where things are, you can learn to find things, and you'll be able to do that all through your Latin studies. Now, what I want you to think about, some of you are young, some of you I know are only like 11 years old, maybe younger than that. Some of you are older, into your teenage years. if you go on to college, you're going to have to do general studies. So it doesn't matter. You could say, well, I'm going to study medicine. I'm going to be an engineer. It doesn't matter. When you go to college, you're still going to have to study language classes, writing classes, history classes. You have to study everything for the first 2 years or so. And then you get into your special studies for your career. So you're going to have general studies into college, assuming most of you will probably go to college. And you're going to have language studies and things like that. And I'm going to recommend you stick with Latin because it will help you to get good grades in college when you can take a language that you've already been working on. And knowing how to use this grammar as a reference book will be helpful for you for years and years to come. And whatever you do in the future, you just never know when language questions come up, especially if you get involved in things. If you get involved in politics or law or any kind of writing work or research, languages are always an issue. So I want you to learn to use this book as a reference book. What I've got on the screen here is the table of contents. So the first thing that I would recommend you do with any reference book is read through the table of contents, because you can get an idea of how this book is organized and where all the information is. So you can see pretty simply it's divided. The first section is etymology. Who can tell me what etymology is in the chat? I'll pull the chat window open here. What is etymology? What does that word mean? What's etymology? What is etymology? No, it's not alphabeti. I don't know what that means. What is etymology? Lara says the meaning of words. That's a good guess. Study of words and letters. That's that's a good guess. Study of words. You're getting close, but not exactly. The first part of grammar. Yeah, good. Sarah got it. The study of the parts of speech. Good. Everybody see what Sarah wrote there? The study of the parts of speech. She nailed it. Orthography is really the first part of grammar, and that's the study of the alphabet, letters, sounds, pronunciation, things like that. That's orthography. It means right writing, it means right spelling, how to spell things. And so in this first chapter here, we see letters and syllables. That's really orthography, okay? Clear this chat box. So orthography is this first section, and you can see the grammar starts with letters and syllables. So if you ever have a question about how a letter should be pronounced or how a syllable should be pronounced, anything like that, accent marks and so on, it's there in the grammar book. You know where to look for that. You look in the section on orthography, where you're dealing with letters and spelling. But then when you get to this second part, you see it's titled Parts of Speech. Now we're really getting into etymology. So the parts of speech, what this refers to in etymology is understanding what all the different forms of words mean, okay? So think about Latin reading. When you're taking Latin reading, you have a passage of the Gospel of John. You've got the first 5 verses, it's lesson 1, and I give you an explanation of what every word means. I tell you what the word means, and you learn the translation, you do the translation exercises, complete the quizzes, and that's it. But sometimes you might look at the explanation I give, and you may wonder, why does it mean that? Why are we told that this word means this in one place, and then in another lesson, it's the same word, but Mr. Michael's got a different meaning in there just to make it more complicated. It's not because it's, I'm not just teasing you or trying to make life hard for you. It's because the forms of the words and the relationships of the different words determine how they're translated into English. So in order to understand why, you can study those lessons, and those lessons teach you the what of Latin reading, right? You learn the word and how to translate it, and then I test you on whether you learn that. But that doesn't explain the why of Latin reading. If you want to understand the reason for the answers that I give, well, you'd have to get into the grammar. And just so you know, the answers that I give could always be disputed. You could always argue with me and say, hey, you know what? I think that what you said here for verse 3, I think you're wrong. I think that should be translated like this. And you could be right, because the argument is based on grammar. right? I'm giving you what I think is the best translation based on my knowledge of grammar, but the rules of grammar are what actually tell us how things should be translated. So that comes from the grammar book. And all of the explanation of the meanings of the different forms, and this can get very complicated sometimes, they're all found in the grammar book. So you can see this section that starts here, the parts of speech. The parts of speech are words. That's how sentences are built. We learned that in our first lessons. But then in Latin, just like in Greek, the parts of speech have all different forms, and the meaning of the words is locked up in those forms. It's almost like a puzzle that you have to solve. You have to take it apart and figure out what all those different parts mean. So you can see that the parts of speech are studied here in this section on etymology. And then we go through the different parts of speech. So it's really very simple once you see how it's laid out. The first part of speech are substantives. Who can tell me what a substantive is? What's a substantive? Tell me in the chat. What's a substantive? George says it's a noun. That's good. There's a little more, though. It's a noun that can exist by itself. Perfect. Very good, Josh. All right. So a substantive is a noun. That's true. It's a kind of noun. One kind of noun is the substantive. So everything about the forms of the nouns or forms of substantive nouns, you can see that all of that is described here. I think this is pages or sections, actually. Sections 17 through 71. So if you've got a question about a noun, what a certain form means, you can't figure it out, or you're curious to understand, that's where you would go. You would look in those sections to find all the forms of substantive nouns. Then we've got inflection of adjectives. So here's all the information on adjectives. Who can tell me what an adjective is? What's an adjective? What's an adjective? Let me know in the chat. What's an adjective? A noun that has to be with a substantive. That's a good answer. We can do a little better though. Sarah says a noun which describes a substantive. That's good. Josh says a noun that denotes a property and is joined with a substantive. That's a very good answer. Ava or Ava, I'm sorry, I still don't know if it's Ava or Ava, says it's placed before the substantive. That's a good answer. It means next to the substantive. Adel says a word that describes a noun, pronoun, or adverb. Good. All right, so let's stop there. We have adjectives and substantives, which we learn are the two different kinds of nouns. Substantives are nouns that signify ideas that can exist by themselves. Adjectives signify things that cannot exist by themselves. For example, blue cannot exist by itself. It has to be a blue something. So if I say blue and I tell you, I ask you, what do you think of when we hear the word blue? You can't answer unless you say a blue something. You'll think of something that's blue, even if it's just like a square that's blue, something like that, okay? A blue fruit, whatever, yeah, flower. So an adjective can't exist by itself. You can't think of the color by itself. You think of something that's colored blue, even if it's just like a strip of paint that's blue. It's still blue paint, right? So you can't think of blue itself. You think of blue something. That's what an adjective is. You can't think of tall itself. You think of a tall something, a tall person, a tall tree, something like that. So that's two kinds of nouns, adjectives and substantives. But what's important here, everything about the forms of substantives and adjectives is described here in these two sections. So you know where to look if you've got a question about a substantive or an adjective. All right, then the next section, very simple. We see another part of speech. We see adverbs. So any information about adverbs that you may have a question about, sections 91 to 93. Numerals, if you're just curious and you want to know how to say, 2023 in Latin, you can go to the section on numerals and find where all of the Latin numbers are explained, okay? So you can see where numerals are listed. Then you've got pronouns. So any questions about pronouns, and pronouns can be very confusing. If you're further along in Latin reading, you know that pronouns, you get all these little Q words like qui, quibus, quo, quisque, cuius, quisquam, all of these Q words, even for me, and I've been studying Latin for 30 years almost, there are times where I still need to look those things up because they can be confusing. So you can go into that pronoun section and find that form and understand exactly what it is. You don't need to guess. You can find those forms. So you can see where pronoun issues would be, sections 99 to 111. Then you get into all the verb forms. Stick with me here and pay attention to the talk. We can chat later. Then you get into verbs, and you know when you're going through Latin reading, the verbs have all different forms, and that affects how they're translated. It tells you who the person is, who the number is, what the tense is. All of that stuff is very important. In order to pass a quiz in Latin reading, you have to know exactly how to translate a verb, and that all of that information that I give you is bound up in the form of that verb. Well, if you want to understand that, or if you're confused or you think I'm wrong, well, here's where you can go and check all the different forms of the verbs, sections 112 to 175. So you can check all that out. Then in the last section here, sections 176 to 200, we have a section on the formation of words, or how words are actually formed in Latin. When we take different parts of words and put them together, we take prepositions and join them with nouns to create new nouns. Same thing with verbs, things like that. If you want to learn about how Latin words are formed and what the different parts of the words mean, there's a whole section on that at the end of etymology. Now, the reason why that part on formation of words is there in etymology is because etymology actually has two meanings. One meaning, which we mentioned before, is the study of the forms of the parts of speech. That's one meaning of the word etymology. But if you look in a dictionary, you'll see a section of the dictionary called etymology when you look up a word. That's a different meaning of the word etymology. Does anybody know what that meaning is? When you look in a dictionary and find the etymology of a word, does anybody know what that means? History of use, not exactly, almost, not meaning, that's just the definition. What is the etymology? George is almost there. No, Lara, that's not right. George almost has it. History of use, that's called usage, but that's not the same as etymology. Lara says the meaning of the parts. Bridget, or whoever, unidentified Golding family member, says origin. That's good. History of words, that's good. So etymology, another meaning of the word etymology is that it shows us the history of where the word came from. This is what you see in an English dictionary. So it'll show you like the word noun, for example. If you look up the word noun in the dictionary and look at the etymology, it will tell you that the word noun in English comes from a French word, which comes from a Latin word, nomen. So it'll show you the history of where that word comes from and what the original source is of that word, which is very helpful because it helps you to understand the real meaning of that word. Okay, that's another use of etymology. Okay, so etymology has two different meanings. One is the study of the forms of the parts of speech. That's really the grammar meaning of etymology. And then you've also got etymology, meaning the history or the origin of the word. That's how etymology is used in a dictionary. Okay, so very good. So we've got that. And that brings us to the end of the etymology section. Then you can see we get into a second section here that's called syntax. And that's a weird word, not a word we use very, very much. Another word for syntax is construction. Construction. So if you think that etymology is the study of the forms of the parts of speech, the study of the words themselves, syntax is the study of how we put those words together to form sentences. All right. So if you want to know, well, how would I write something? How would I write something in Latin? Or how do I know what this sentence actually means? That really comes from syntax. So the rules of construction. And I'm pretty sure I'm right about this, but I think the word syntax is like the word concrete. Okay, so if you think about a brick wall, the bricks are like the parts of speech, they're like the words, and the cement that's used to join the bricks together, that's syntax. Okay, the rules of how the parts of speech are joined together. All right, so syntax is where we find all the rules of construction. You see, this first part is titled the simple sentence. So rules for simple sentence making. So if you've studied elementary grammar, think back to elementary grammar. If you studied elementary grammar, you start learning about subject, predicate, copulas. You learn how sentences are formed. That's a simple sentence. So if you want to learn how to do that in Latin, well, that's studied here in syntax, okay? So those lessons, even though it's like Latin grammar level 2, it's actually simple stuff. It's just learning how simple sentences are made with Latin, what the rules are, and so on. Because Latin's a little different than English because of all of those forms of words. It's not the same as English. In English, if we have a subject and a predicate, here's a question for you. If we have a sentence in English, how do we know what the subject and the predicate is when we look at a sentence? How do we know? We've got this list of words that makes a sentence. How do we know what's the subject, what's the predicate? How do we know in English? Who has an idea? Who studied? Yeah, Joshua, very good. The position of the words. All right, the position of the words. Normally in English, what do we put first? What do we put first when we make a sentence in English? What do we put the subject first? What do we put second? A verb, right? Sometimes a copula, which is like a simple linking verb. And then what do we put after the verb? The predicate. Good. Okay, so we understand in English, when we read a sentence, we expect the subject to come first, then we expect the verb, and then we expect the predicate. Sometimes the verb is part of the predicate. Okay, good. So we understand that in English, we look for the word order to actually help us understand the meaning of the sentence. But in Latin, we don't necessarily have to do that. Latin is more complicated. Why is Latin more complicated than English? Who can tell me that? Why is Latin more complicated? Because it's a different language? That's not why. Different forms of words, that's kind of an answer. You're asking a question which is really not an answer. Why in Latin is reading a sentence a little more complicated? Taking some wild guesses here. The answer, yeah, George says inflection. That's a good word to add there, but what does it mean? Looks like some of you are really taking some wild guesses. Endings. Yeah, so all right, so good. We found a gap. So let me explain. English is a language that doesn't rely on word forms. It doesn't rely on word forms. It's not like Latin and Greek. We put words in order, and that's how we understand what's being said. In Latin and Greek is the same. It depends on word forms. So there can be a form of a word that shows that it's in the predicate, and there can be a form of a word that shows that it's the subject. And those words really can be put in different places because in the Latin language, the people know to look for the form of the word to understand the sentence, not the order of the words. So there is a normal order of words in Latin, but it doesn't need to be followed because of the forms of words. Now, in English, you'll find people do the same thing when we have like hymns or songs or poems. You'll find that for the sake of the poem or for the sake of the rhythm of a song, the author might move the words around in English in an unnatural way. And if you just read it, it really won't make much sense. You have to actually think about it and understand that it's poetry or that it's music. And you have to understand that the author moved things around in a way that really isn't proper English and that's called poetic license. Poetic license, I'll type it in the chat box so you can see this phrase. Poetic license means that if you're writing poetry or if you're writing a song or something like that, and you're concerned about rhyming things or the rhythm of different lines, you're given freedom to kind of move things around and not follow the normal rules. That's called poetic license. License means freedom. So if you're using poetic language, you have some freedom to break the rules of syntax for the sake of the poetry. But normally in English, we follow word order, whereas in Latin, you don't need to do that. But when, this is why if you say, hey, Mr. Michael, I would like to translate the Salve Regina, or I would like to translate this Latin hymn that we sing at church, and you look at it, you'll find that it's very difficult to translate because it's poetry. And the rules that you learn in elementary Latin will not help you to translate the poetry, because there will be things all over the place. There will be phrases moved around, words moved around. The writers can even change the forms of words. They can abbreviate words and cut syllables out of them so it fits the rhythm of the poetry. Translating a prayer or a poem or a hymn in Latin is actually very difficult. So sometimes that's the first thing students try to do. Some people will, let's say you go to a Latin mass, or you even go to an English mass, but maybe there's a part of the mass that's said in Latin, and you go home and you say, I'd like to figure out what that means. That's actually difficult translation work. So sometimes that's more difficult than reading ordinary Latin. So sometimes people think Latin is very, very difficult because they try to translate a hymn or a poem. And that's really not where you should ever start translating Latin, because it's more difficult. That's like if a child was 5 years old and he wanted to learn English, that would be like handing that child Shakespeare and say, here, why don't you read this? And Shakespeare is in Shakespeare's plays, most people don't realize this, but in all of Shakespeare's plays, his plays are written as poems. They're actually written in lines that have rhythm. It's poetry. His whole play is poetry. That's why Shakespeare is difficult to read, because he uses poetic license when he writes. And so you've got to realize that when you're reading Shakespeare, you don't just grab it and start reading it. You have to actually study it, learn his meaning, because he's going to be using expressions that are unusual. And then when you get the idea of the meaning, then you can practice memorizing it and reciting it with understanding of the meaning in its form as poetry. So that's not easy. And that's what it's like to try to translate a Latin hymn or a Latin prayer. They're often very difficult to translate, okay? But here in syntax, we see we start with simple sentences, simple, normal sentence structure. You can learn all the rules of how sentences are formed, and this can be very complicated. And we'll talk about some reasons why. So then in the second section here, you see sections 284 to 471, simple sentence expanded. So now we get into some more complicated language, okay? We expand the simple sentence. And again, if you studied English grammar, you'll understand what a lot of this stuff is. But if you've never studied English grammar, you're not even going to know what this stuff is. That's why you need to study English grammar. Whether it's elementary grammar or classical grammar, in English, it'll help you to prepare for Latin grammar. But sentence structure, more complicated sentence structure is explained in these sections. Then we get to compound sentences, which get more complicated. That's explained down here, sections 472 to 670. And we go on to the end of that. Notice down here under syntax, it says figures of syntax and rhetoric. So those are figures of speech. Who can tell me what a figure of speech is? What are figures of speech? Let's see who's doing their work here. What are figures of speech? We've got this section, figures of syntax and rhetoric. And in English, especially if you've studied English literature, we've talked about figures of speech. In English composition, if you're further along in English composition, we've studied figures of speech. What are figures of speech? Anybody have anything to share about that? Nope, nope, nope. If you're answering with a question, you probably don't know, right? Rebecca says a phrase that doesn't mean what it says. That's a good start. Joshua says different meanings. That's you're kind of scratching the surface there. What are figures of speech? What are figures of speech? Okay, well, I'll tell you, and it's good. We found another gap. If you study English composition, like I said, you get into this. If you study English literature, you get into this. All right, that's all. Well, that's enough for answers. I understand that we don't know what that means. Figures of speech are different expressions, and here's the problem, okay? You use figures of speech every day. You hear figures of speech every day. You read figures of speech every day. You use figures of speech every day. You just don't know that they're figures of speech because you've learned a lot of these figures of speech just by hearing them or reading them, and you don't really think about what's going on. Figures of speech are expressions where we express an idea using words that literally don't express that idea. So it's got a figurative meaning. It's called figurative language, right? So any kind of language that goes beyond basic, simple sentences is going to be figures of speech. For example, if I say, this class is so boring, I'm going to die, right? That's a figure of speech. It's not literal. No one's going to actually die if this class is boring. You know, it's not a cause of death. That's just an expression. It's called hyperbole. That's one of the figures of speech, okay? You're trying to express an idea. You want to express that this class is so boring. It's so boring, and I want to express this in a way that sort of communicates my feelings. And so I say, this class is so boring that I think I'm going to die, right? That's a figure of speech, okay? If you say something like, oh, I'm so hungry, I could eat a cow, that's another hyperbole. That's a figure of speech, okay? So figures of speech are expressions where we use language in creative ways to express ideas to have some kind of, usually an emotional effect on the reader, okay? If I wanted to say I was flying a kite outside and it flew as high as a mountain, right? I'm trying to communicate how high this kite was flying. And I don't want to say something nerdy like, I was flying my kite and it flew approximately 740 feet. Like, that's nerdy. That might be accurate, but that's really not what I want to communicate, you know? What I mean is, it was very, very high. So I use a figure of speech, and there's a bunch of figures of speech. If you want to learn about the figures of speech, it's right there in the grammar book, Figures of Syntax and Rhetoric, and you can find this in English grammar books as well. Okay. I threw a snake and it flew into space. Good. That's an example of a figure of speech. Any kind of comparison, the sun, or if I say something like the flashlight on my phone is as bright as the sun. As the sun, that's called a simile, right? That's another figure of speech where you make a comparison. So there's lots of figures of speech, different kinds of figures of speech. And we need to study them in English first, in English grammar and English composition, but we also need to study them if we're going to study another language, because when we read other languages, I mean, this gets really complicated. If we read another language, we have to realize that those writers and speakers also used figures of speech. So we can't interpret what they wrote literally if they meant it to be a figure of speech. Just like, imagine if somebody from China was reading something that I wrote in English and I said, like I was saying before, this class is so boring, I'm going to die. And so all of a sudden, like, the police showed up because, or someone called 911 because they heard that you were about to die. That's the danger of figures of speech, is that the people who hear or read them have to understand how to interpret figures of speech. If a Chinese person came to America and was trying to learn English, and we spoke about something and used a figure of speech, realize how confusing that would be to a person who doesn't really know the language very well. It would be very difficult for that person to understand, because it's a complex way of communicating for people who are very comfortable with the language and the ideas of the language. So when we go and read Latin, if we're reading Cicero, for example, Cicero may use a phrase and we're translating it, and we've got this boring translation of what Cicero said, but actually that may be a figure of speech in Latin, just like we use figures of speech. And the only way we would know that is by learning about figures of speech in Latin. Same thing in Greek. So that makes translation more complicated. Okay. All right. So that's figures of syntax and rhetoric. And then you've got a summary here, which is very helpful in sections 437 to 434, or pages actually. Follow me here. Don't get distracted by the chat. You've got principal rules of syntax on pages 437, which is like a summary of the rules of syntax. So very helpful. Next, we get into prosody. All right. Prosody. This is the third and final part, or I could say fourth part. We have orthography, etymology, syntax, and prosody. This is the fourth part. Does anybody want to take a guess at what prosody is? Prosody. You can look at the topics. You don't have to be a dum-dum and take a wild guess. You can take an intelligent guess by looking at the topics that are listed under that section in this grammar book. Look at this, look at the topics. What do you think prosody is? Okay, I see some good answers. Bridget, or one of the Goldings, has that right. Latin poetry. That's good. George wrote not poetry, normal. I don't know what that means. What you typed there looks like not normal speech. Jackson wrote quantity. Jude wrote quantity. Connor wrote speech that has rhythm, patterns, and poetry. That's good. Not normal speech. Not normal speech. Study of poetry or the embellishment of words. That's very good. So that's enough, okay? It's poetry. It's when we take into consideration different rhythms or rhyme patterns, what's called meter, or different measures of poetry. For example, in Latin Reading 3, if any of you ever get there, in Latin Reading 3, we're going to read Latin poetry. And in order to read Latin poetry, you have to understand the rhythm of the poem, and you have to learn how to read and pronounce the Latin words so that you can actually hear and feel the rhythm of the poetry. So we would study prosody in order to understand Latin poetry. So all the rules of poetry, rhythm, meter, things like that, are studied in prosody. We also have to pay attention to pronunciation much more in prosody, because we learn rules for pronunciation in the beginning of grammar. We learn how to read, we learn how to pronounce letters and syllables, we learn a little bit about accent, but we usually don't worry about that very much because we're focused on reading and translating. When you get to poetry, however, you've really got to be good at pronunciation, because if you don't pronounce things correctly, you'll mess up the rhythm of the poetry. So you've got to really learn the rules for pronunciation. And so we start there. If you look at this first topic, you see it says quantity, and that's got to do with the length of vowels and the length of syllables, and how the rules of accent relate to those rules of accents and syllable length. Okay, so first we've got to really make sure everyone understands pronunciation. And then we get into the different forms of poetry, different rhythms and meters and things like that, so you can read and appreciate Roman poetry, Latin poetry, okay? Now, the last section, which may be of interest to you, just if you're curious about Roman information, what's called Latinity or Roman, Roman civilization type stuff. There's an appendix at the end of this grammar book that talks about the Roman calendar, Roman weights and measures, Roman money, how Roman names work, and things like that. So just a bunch of helpful information at the end of the grammar book. All right. So that's what this grammar book contains. You see, there's tons and tons of information. It's all laid out in the table of contents, and you can learn to use this book as a reference book anytime that you're curious about words or translations or phrases of the Latin language. So as you're working through Latin reading, like I said, in Latin reading, we're just learning the what of the Latin language. We're learning how to translate, and you're just being told the answers, really, just to get started, to build your vocabulary, get you used to what Latin feels like, and so on. But when we get into grammar, the more you get into grammar, the more you'll understand about the why of the translation, okay? And that becomes really important. So you've got to study grammar to understand the why of a language, and this reference grammar allows you to both study the grammar from beginning to end, like we're doing in Latin grammar, but also to just hop in and out of this book and use it for reference when you've got a question. And as time goes on, you'll be able to do that more and more. So that, I hope, is a helpful overview of this Latin grammar book, why it's called a reference grammar, and how you can use it if you've got questions about Latin words and things like that, okay? George asks, do you recommend a non-reference Latin grammar, as in one that leads you through the study of the language? No, I don't, okay? I really don't recommend that for a couple of reasons. First of all, I think you should focus on Latin reading first, because you have no Latin vocabulary, right? So you have to build a Latin vocabulary. Just think about it. When you were 2 years old, 3 years old, you just started learning words, right? You learned the names of different things. You learned to point at things in your house, and you learned what each thing was called. And then as a toddler, you'd start to try to communicate with your parents. You would just use words, like you would just hold your cup up to your mother and yell juice, right? Like you don't know how to form a sentence. You haven't learned syntax yet. You don't say, "Excuse me, mother, I would like some juice, please." You just hold the cup up as a bratty little toddler and yell juice, right? That's how you communicate with a word. And then as time goes on, you learn expressions and phrases and different ways of communicating. You start to learn figures of speech and rhetoric. You learn that there's a right way and a wrong way to ask for something. You develop the complexity of your speech over time, but it all starts with vocabulary. And that's why I really believe that Latin reading should come first. And then when you're in Latin reading, you're going to already start to pick up lots of grammatical information, just as you do as a kid. I mean, you were speaking English when you were 5 years old, 7 years old, 10 years old. You didn't have any grammar knowledge likely at that time, but you were just learning by experience, by being immersed in the language. You learned. Hopefully, if your parents speak proper English, you were learning how to speak English properly just by imitating the English that you heard. So you learn grammar just by reading, just by listening. So you're going to pick up a lot of grammar that way. By the time there's a need for formal grammar study, you can use a reference grammar. What I see other homeschool programs doing, and I'll admit what I even tried to do with Alvarez's grammar was present the grammar in a certain way like that, but it just becomes too slow. It's too slow. It gets in the way and doesn't allow you to progress as quickly as you can, especially when you're older and you already know one language. You already know English. You already understand how language works. You can study the language much more quickly, and I think that's why you should study with a grammar book, a reference grammar, okay? Connor asks, should we do about 10 lessons, then go to Latin grammar? I think what's going to happen, Connor, is as you go through Latin reading lessons, you're going to start to see that in one lesson, this word is translated like this, and then in another lesson, it's translated like this, and it's going to start getting complicated because when you take a quiz, only the translation from that lesson is going to be marked as a right answer. And you're going to start to wonder, how in the world can I figure out, other than just memorizing it, how can I figure out what the difference is? And you're going to see, like, that's when you're ready to start digging into grammar, right? Because you want to understand the why of things, okay? So that's a good question. But again, you know, the grammar course starts with the alphabet and you know, letters and letter sounds and accent and pronunciation. So I don't know why you wouldn't get started with that right away. You can get started right away, but you're not going to understand the other grammar. I mean, other programs, I know they start having you like memorize the noun declensions before you've even read anything. And that's just boring. You know, who wants to sit around memorizing noun declensions and verb forms when you're not even learning any vocabulary? That's not how you learned English, right? You didn't start learning English when you were 3 years old. Your mother started making you memorize, you know, grammar rules. You just started talking and learning vocabulary. So we can learn Latin the same way. I think it's more fun to start with reading. I think it's more helpful to start with reading, and you know, it's easier. So that's why I do it this way. Okay, so we've gone over this grammar book. You've got a flyover of how it's arranged. I hope that was helpful. That's what I wanted to share today. So I don't have anything else. The only thing I would say is, let's just take a look at some of these pages just so you get a view of them. So let's say you come across a noun and you want to understand what the form of the noun means. Let's just check some of this out. Let's go down here, find section 17. Bear with me as I scroll. So we're just going to go look for Article 17. Here in Article 16, we've got the parts of speech. Then down when we get to Article 17, we learn about inflection, which is the different changes in the forms of words. And then you see here, section 18 or Article 18, we have the substantive. So we've got a definition of what a substantive is. We talk about the gender of substantives, which you're going to learn in syntax is very important. You don't really need to understand that at this point, but when you get into syntax, gender is important. Then the number of a noun is important when you try to you know, associate it with a verb, for example. Then we learn about the cases. So if you wonder what the cases mean, here you've got an explanation of the cases. And then eventually we get into the declensions and you start learning all the endings and the forms. So if you see the form of a word, you can see here we've got tables of the declensions. If you see a form of a word, you can look at that ending, go find it in the grammar book and understand exactly what it is. All right. Okay, so that's all I wanted to share today. I just wanted to give you an overview of our grammar book, how it's set up and how you can use it. Okay, so if you've got no questions today and you'd like to get out of here, you're free to go at this time. If you've got any questions or would like to talk about anything further, I'll stay on here as long as you continue to ask questions. So just so you know, the Goldings asked, are all meetings at the same time? As of right now, we just have meetings Monday through Thursday at 1 o'clock Eastern time. I'm planning to add a Friday class, and my heart of hearts desires to have more classes. I know that you can't all come to more classes, so I'm not asking you to be present at all of these classes, but I would like to have more classes. I'd like to teach the Summa Theologica. I'd like to do the catechism. I'd like to do, I had a request yesterday for history classes. So I'd like to do more live classes. The question is simply whether students would attend. That's the big thing, because if nobody comes, then I might as well just make videos. So, you know, we'll work that out over time. But I'd like to have more classes because there's a lot of stuff I'd like to help students understand. And I'd like to help you get into more advanced classes that you might struggle with on your own, but with some help, they're really not difficult. That's what I'd like to help you with. So we'll see. I'll post announcements. You'll see them. Hopefully when I post an announcement on the study center, you get an email. That's my main way to communicate. So if I get any ideas about other classes, I'll let you know. Okay. Let's see. do you recommend taking classical grammar? Let me stop sharing my screen here. Get back to the regular screen. Do you recommend, I saw a question about classical grammar. Let's see, where'd that go? Victor asked, do you recommend taking classical grammar and Latin grammar at the same time? Like I said, Latin grammar starts with simple things like the alphabet and pronunciation, so I don't think that there's any reason to wait for that. I do think that studying classical grammar can help if you're weak in grammar, because when we get into Latin grammar, if we start talking about subjects and predicates and things, and you don't even know what those things are in English, it's just doubly difficult to understand them in Latin. So if we're going to learn those things, it's probably easier to learn them in English first and then know that and move into Latin. That's what that classical grammar course is actually designed to do. It's intended to teach English grammar for students who are going to study classical languages. So that's definitely recommended. But I would just say to try to do as much as you can. It's not like you're going to accidentally fly through any of these courses, so we don't have to worry about you like crashing into the end of the curriculum too fast, you know? George asks, in logic and rhetoric, the assessment questions 4 and 6 both say the same thing. Are they general questions that apply to every lesson, or is it a copy and paste mistake? Sometimes I copy questions from one lesson to another and then edit them. You think it's just a copy paste mistake? Maybe I didn't finish them yet. Okay, thank you all of you who are taking off. Thanks for coming. Sarah asks, should you study the Latin grammar lessons in chronological order, or can just start randomly jumping around depending on our interest? I'm going to say yes, you can. You can jump around. You know, there's no reason why you can't jump around. The only problem is if something's explained in an earlier lesson and you miss that and then get into a later lesson and you find that you can't understand it. But if you look at a later lesson, like you want to just jump ahead to the noun declensions and you feel like you understand what everything means in that lesson, then great, you know, you can do that. And if you want to do that, just so you know, if you want to do that and you look and you see, I don't have a lesson prepared for that, just let me know. And, you know, I'll put lessons together as you go through them. That's not a problem. Just so you know, the way that I do things, you know, I have my own plan and schedule for how I develop things based on what I see students actually working on. And also, you know, I'm selfish too, where there are courses that I want to put together, even if very few students are working on them. It's just my own personal desire. But, you know, I respond to requests from students when there's something that you need. Obviously, that goes to the front of my list. So just let me know if there's anything you need. Okay, thank you everybody for coming. Those of you who are taking off. George, I'll check that out. Let me just jot a note down to myself. So you're talking about lesson 4 and 6 in logic and rhetoric. I'll check it out. Logic and rhetoric, lesson 4 and 6. Okay, I've got a note here for that. I'll check it out. Let's see, anything else? Some of you have high-tech Zoom chat skills, I see, and can color things. That, just so you know, when I see all of these student technical skills on display, that's why I have no mercy when I hear, oh, you know, I can't figure out how to submit an assignment. I can't figure out how to do my work. I say, baloney. I see all of your, you know, all the goofy skills you have when you want to. You can figure it out. Victor says, if you're still taking suggestions for Friday class, would you consider a writing class? That's what I said. I said on Friday, what I think I'm going to do is writing, logic, and rhetoric kind of all together, so we can talk about all 3 of those subjects. And look, if we get into a subject and we find that our live class time isn't enough, then we can break it into a number of different classes and focus on individual subjects. But I'll start out with some general classes like Latin studies. We're doing vocab, reading, and grammar. all at the same time. If we really start getting into grammar, or if you guys really want to get into Latin reading together, well, then we'd have to make separate classes. And we'll do that over time if there's interest. It's up to you guys, really. Bridget asked, or one of the Goldings asked, what is the next Latin meeting about? Well, we did some grammar here. We'll probably get back into Latin reading next week, because what I like to do with Latin reading is, like I said, I think you guys are doing pretty well with Latin reading right now with the translation exercises and quizzes, but I'd like to help you to see, to learn more about the Latin vocabulary and understand it better. So maybe go through Latin reading together and talk a little bit about the words and vocabulary and things like that. So probably Latin reading. We'll probably go back and forth week by week, unless nobody wants to do that and you'd rather just do grammar or something. Okay. All right. I'll see you next week. Margaret. When are the next elementary geometry lessons coming? Yeah, that's a new course. So again, I told you I've been very busy with grading, right? So developing lessons, I have to do both things at the same time. I've got to publish new lessons, but I've also got to grade assignments for past lessons, and I've got to keep those things going at the same time. So this week I'm trying to get through this grading because I fell behind because of some family events. And so my list of, Mrs. Michael, she takes most of your messages and tickets and stuff like that, and she makes me Post-it notes, lists of things to do. So you can see here that I've got a pile of things to do that's all over my desk. So once I get through grading, I'll get some more lessons posted. Yeah. So I've got Post-it notes all over the place, but I've got to keep everything going at the same time, so I've got to get you into new lessons, then grade your work in those lessons, then get you new lessons and grade the work. So it's just like constant going back and forth. All right. So that's what's going on. And like I said, if you communicate, you'll understand what's going on, and I'll also know what you need, because what Mrs. Michael does, just so you know, if you write a ticket in, you send something in, let me know what you're working on. I'll show you here if I can find a good example. Mrs. Michael takes a note of what you request, and she leaves me a note. So this says Latin Reading 2, Lesson 7, a quiz needs questions, and this is from a student named Joyce. So I'll know who requested it. I'll know what's requested. I'll know how important it is. I'll know whether it's a student I like or a student I don't like. So I take all the students I don't like and I stick them on the bottom of the pile and do the students I like first. No, I don't do that. I'm just kidding. But, I'll also see that, 5 different students recommended the same thing. So I know that's important. So just make sure if you need something, you let us know, because that's how stuff gets done. Okay. Yeah, so, Daniel, you should take rhetoric, but, really what I would recommend, Daniel, is English composition. You have to do that first. You have to learn basic composition first, and then we can get into the details of writing. Okay? You're not going to persuade everyone if you don't even know how to write a paragraph. So we've got to get basic writing skills down, and then once we've got basic writing skills down and we can write comfortably and we know how to write, then we can start getting into the details of how to argue and write persuasively. Okay? English composition is really the beginning. George said, I meant questions 4 and 6. That's important. Let me check that out. So what lesson was that, George? Can you tell me what lesson that was? We can get into so much cool stuff if we work together. I really don't think you can do all of this stuff on your own. And I don't ask you to do it. There is some stuff that you do have to do on your own. Like, for example, Latin reading, you've got to learn vocabulary on your own. That's just, you've got to do the work. English composition, you've got to do the work on your own to learn basic writing skills. But once you get into those, once you get good at it, then we can start getting into some more complicated stuff. We can learn how to debate. We can learn how to write argumentative essays. If you're planning to go to college, we can do like SAT prep stuff. We can do college writing help and stuff. So it's really just a matter of time. Daniel says, is rhetoric the class that you're going to do on Friday? Yes. Now, if you ask, can you do rhetoric? If you mean, can I come to that rhetoric class? Yes. The classes are available to anybody. Anybody who wants to come to a live class can come. And I think they'll just be helpful for your studies overall. Okay. Plus, another benefit, if you're a high school student, you need 120 hours of instructional time for every subject. You can count these meetings as an hour of instructional time. So if we do like, for example, if we have an hour a week in Latin, you can count that as an hour a week of instructional time. If we do it for 36 weeks, that's 36 hours of instructional time in Latin. So that's like a quarter of the amount of time you need. So it's good for your high school studies or just any subjects. You can count this as an hour of instructional time. Okay. That's another reason why it's important to do this. Any other questions? Any other issues? Any other complaints? Any other anything else? If we're through most of the Latin study questions, if there's just anything else on your mind in any of your studies that you'd like to talk about while we're on chat here together, we can do it. Well, you mentioned Seton homeschool, George. It's just very different. It's a different goal. It's a matter of goals. If all you want to do is check the boxes and get a high school diploma, then Seton's good. If that's what you want, if you want to check the boxes, get a high school diploma, and be done with school, well, that's what that's for. If you want to get into subjects like logic and rhetoric and classical languages, they don't even have them. So it's just different goals. Okay. How different is modern Latin and classical Latin? Not very different. Not very different. The modern Latin is softer. So some of the hard sounds of classical Latin get softer. Like instead of saying caelum, which is hard, we say caelum, which is softer. So it's a softer language. There's not many differences. The words are the same, just the pronunciation is different. Good question. Any other questions? Anything else you'd like to talk about? As you get older, if you want to start talking about any college prep type stuff, college plans, help getting ready with your high school diploma stuff, you need help with that, I've been doing this a long time, so I'm happy to help you guys. Anna's wondering why we see the letter W in Latin reading if it's not in the Latin alphabet. I don't know if do we see the letter W in Latin reading? I'm not sure. Can you think of a word? I can't think of one off the top of my head. Not sure if we see any W's. I mean, later in European Latin, we'll start to see W's because there are people's names. Like, my name, William, would be like Wilhelmus, right? In like European history, I'd be Wilhelmus. So you'd see a W because it was a European name, but not Latin. I don't know if I can think of any real Latin words that would have a W, but you could have a Latin word that actually has a double U, right? Like two U's together. Like, for example, I'll type this in the chat so you can see it. You have the word genuum. That's a double U, right? That's where the idea comes from. No, I'm serious. That's where the idea comes from of W. That's what it is. Because when you say it, think about how you pronounce it. You say genuum. You get that W sound. It's made by the W. Antiquum. Very good, George. So you can see the W is a real thing, and then eventually it's just symbolized by a letter. Okay. That's a W. Not the figure W, but the sounds. Anna's wondering if that would be a V. I like how Joseph presents the questions in Anna's name, so he doesn't seem like he doesn't know. That's a good question. Now, if you go back, right, if you look at Roman, let's say you have a Roman building, right? You look at a building in ancient Rome, you'll see the letter written like a V, like a pointy letter V, and that's the letter U. Now, who can tell me, in a world where things were engraved in stone, who can tell me why the Romans would write with the form of a V rather than the rounded form of a U? Imagine you had to inscribe something in stone. Why would it be favorable? Yeah, V is much easier to make a pointed V than to carve out a curved U, right? That'd be a mess. Imagine trying to get every single U to have exactly the same curve. That'd be a nightmare. Straight lines are easier with a chisel, that's right. Okay, so it makes sense why they would favor that V shape. But then in handwriting, when you're writing by hand, it's actually easier to make a U than a V. So it's the opposite in handwriting. So it's just, it's just simple dopey stuff like that that actually causes these changes over time. The way that things are said, the way that things are written. Nobody in ancient Rome, had a ballpoint pen in their pocket, walking around grabbing a sheet of paper, writing things. There was none of that stuff. Okay, good questions. Good questions. Anything else? Any other lingering Latin or Greek questions or study questions at all? This is the kind of stuff that these live classes are for. You see how we can just get into sometimes it's kind of like random information. I'm not going to put that in a lesson. The lessons would be 500 pages long and they'd look like a modern textbook with stuff just like all over the pages. I like to keep the written lessons simple. It's easier to discuss this stuff in a live class. So that's good. Another thing I wanted to say for any of you students who are premium students, if there's a time where you'd like to, sometimes it's hard for my wife to get through your planners. If you'd like to meet and have me go over your planner with you, we can find meeting times to do that. Just let me know. I like to meet with students as well to see what you're working on. We just have to make sure we find time for it. But I think the future of studies is going to be more and more Zoom lessons and things like that. So we've got to learn to use these things, and I can help you with your studies. We just have to set up activities and find times to do it. I'm willing to do it. It's just a matter of organizing them. Talk to your parents, see what they'd like you to do. And if you get any ideas, let me know. Your parents might like if I keep you occupied all day and keep you out of their hair. They might love it. Any other questions? Any other issues with your studies? Everybody have everything they need for their studies? All right, well, seeing no more questions, I think we're going to call it a day here. If any questions come up, just send us an email or create a ticket on the website. All that stuff comes right to Mrs. Michael and I, so we'll see it if you send it. And sometimes if you send a request and I don't respond, I saw it. I may just be working on it. Okay, so you can be 100% certain that I see every message you send. Sometimes instead of wasting time responding, I just get to work on it, try to get it done. Okay, so if you send a message, just start checking to see if I got around to it. I might have already done it. For Latin, I saw a question there. In writing Latin, should we write V instead of U? Well, you know what it comes down to? It comes down to usually if you're reading and studying Christian Latin, you should use the pronunciation and the forms of Christian Latin. And if you're studying and writing Roman Latin, you should practice using older Roman forms. So in Latin reading 1, you're not studying any Roman Latin, you're studying Christian Latin, the writing of Saint Jerome. So we would use Christian pronunciation. But in Latin reading 2, we study Cicero, and you should learn to read it as Cicero would have read it, because in English composition, we learn about euphony, where good writers think about how their writing sounds. And so when Cicero was writing, he was thinking about how his writing would sound when it was read, and he was basing that on classical Roman pronunciation, not Christian pronunciation. So it's important. All right. Any other things before we wrap up? Thank you guys for coming. I like meeting with students. I like working on these things together because I want to help you work through these lessons as fast as possible. And there's also a selfish reason for meeting with you. I like to meet with students because when I explain things, your assignments are better and it makes it easier for me to grade. So I have a choice to teach a live class or to have more difficulty grading, and I'd rather teach a live class. Makes all the assignments better, makes grading easier, allows you to progress faster, makes your parents happier. So, everybody benefits from having some class meetings. Don't get hung up on all that V and U stuff. It's really just historical changes that take place. They didn't have pens and paper in ancient Rome. They didn't print books like we do in ancient Rome. So when these things developed, this stuff changed. Okay. There's no like secret reason for it. It's just, it's practical stuff. All right. So that's going to be all for today. I don't see any more questions. If anything pops up, let me know. I'll see you guys next week. What is today? Wednesday. So tomorrow's Thursday. We'll do Greek studies tomorrow. I don't know if I can meet for Greek Friday class just yet. I think I'll announce it first, but just so you also know, Friday afternoon, I'm going to have an hour where I open my personal Zoom meeting room. And if you have any questions on anything, I'm just going to have what's called office hours on Friday afternoon. You can just pop in, say hello, and ask any questions you have. So if you need any help before the weekend, I'll have some office hours available, and I'll open them up probably like 2 o'clock, and I'll just stay on as long as there's students asking for help. So if you need any help Friday afternoons, I'll be available in my personal meeting room. It's just classicalliberarts.com. I'll type the address /meet WCM. That's for anybody. I'm not gonna say no to somebody who's asking for help. Premium support is really for us to help you with your planners and to manage your studies and things like that, which is helpful, especially as you get into higher level studies. So we know what lessons you need and things. But students who are enrolled as just regular students or extern students, they often make their way up to premium over time, like high school years and things like that. So, oops, that's an Amber Alert on my phone. Sorry about that. So that's it. I'll take questions from anybody. I'm not going to, reject you at the gates, So, all right. So office hours, Friday afternoon, 2:00 p.m. Eastern time. I'll be available in my personal meeting room. If anybody's just got, it's the end of the week, you've got some questions at the end of the week, you can meet me during that time. I'll just take first person there. We'll go first. And if I see people waiting in line, I'll just take them in order. So just get in there and hang out if you see other people in there. All right, my pleasure. I enjoy these classes. Like I said, we can have more if your parents and you would like them. Just let me know. We'll continue with our schedule like this until Christmas time. And then when we get into next term, January, we can talk about some new plans. I'm studying myself, so I've got my own work to do. So I've got to make sure that I can make time for studies. But as long as we can work things out, I think these classes can be helpful. All right, so I'll catch you guys tomorrow for Greek studies. If anything comes up, just let me know by email. So I'll see you guys tomorrow or next week. All right, thanks for coming, guys. God bless everybody.